This is the roadmap for becoming a better food forest designer. They're lessons from a trip that I organized across 3 different states of Brazil with other food forest designers that I've been training. We visited syntropic sites across each of the states, learning lessons along the way that I'm about to share with you. Let's start in the south of Brazil with the agroforestry vineyard. This agroforestry vineyard is one of the coolest sites that we saw. They're incorporating agroforestry into a commercial vineyard. The owner has transitioned from a career in professional viticulture into agroforestry over the last few years, putting a huge emphasis on soil biology rather than just chemical inputs like phosphorus and nitrogen. The layout of this system is done in 24-meter modules that are repeating, with alternating rows of grapes in the middle of each module, where the other lines have trees in them. This has helped to balance the scalability and the simplicity of the system, while also maintaining the diversity with the tree crops. Now, the ecological role of grapes is that they climb into the canopy and they bring trees down. They're a transition species that help an ecosystem move into the next stage of succession. This can be really challenging in a vineyard context because it's hard to grow grapes on trees at a big scale. That's why they use trellis systems in conventional vineyards. So in this site, they kept the vines on these Y-shaped trellises just to keep it scalable. Now, in terms of tree integration, in these tree lines, they had a diversity of cash crops. They had lines of blackberries and blueberries. And then in the tree lines, they had things like plums, citrus, guava, and even yerba mate. They also had a series of support trees, things like eucalyptus and other nitrogen-fixing species. One of the most interesting things about this system is that it had a wave shape across the strata. And so as you look down the middle where they have the vineyard lines, what they were doing there was they were maximizing sun, right? So they put their tall trees furthest away from the vines. So the height of the system, its apex of the curve, was in the lines where the tallest trees would exist. And this is all happening inside of these 24-meter modules that just repeat, make it really scalable. I thought this system was really cool because it balanced the simplicity of commercializing things and making them scalable while also incorporating agroforestry in a simple way that's not overly complex and impossible to manage. An awesome demonstration of moving monocultures, especially vines, a more tricky crop, into agroforestry. Now, speaking of tricky systems, our next area is going to highlight working off contour. It's a really controversial idea, working off contour. All of the traditional permaculture literature says work on contour, work along the slope. That's what all the literature says, but I'm going to share why working up the slope is better. And I'll do that by explaining why a majority of the farms in Brazil practicing syntropic agroforestry are like this. And this is even including the new areas that Ernst Gauch is planting himself, straight up the slope. So there's 3 main reasons why the permaculture literature typically recommends planting and working on contour. The first is to improve water infiltration, to slow the water down and allow it to soak into the landscape. The second reason is to prevent erosion. When you're working on contour, the idea is that it's going to keep erosion from happening. And the third reason is for efficiency of management, operational efficiency. But it seems there's a better alternative that we can learn when we observe natural systems, like the forest. Because the first 2 of those reasons, water infiltration and erosion control, both of those are ecosystem services that are perfectly fulfilled by having a forest. Having a forest fulfills those ecosystem services, and it doesn't require the earthworks, the digger, and all the labor that would be involved in creating terraces or contouring the landscape. The next lesson that we can pull apart from the natural systems is that having a diverse canopy and root systems in the ground will slow the impact of the water and reduce erosion. Very little of the actual rainfall that comes down in a forest hits the soil. Like 98% of it is captured by the canopy and it slowly drips down, and what does make it to the soil runs down the roots into the ground. Water infiltration as an ecosystem service rather than getting expensive machinery and equipment in, or just tons of labor hand digging swales or terraces. And then when you have all that organic material on the forest floor of a forest, again, learning from the forest, all that organic material and the fungal networks that exist, those are acting like sponges that keep the water, that slow it down, that retain that moisture in the soil. Again, ecosystem services or expensive earthworks and a bunch of labor. We have a lot to learn from the forest. None of these ecosystem services require expensive earthworks. That's the point. And so the goal, instead of doing contour work, instead of shaping the land, the goal is to establish a forest as quickly and efficiently as possible, so you can get those ecosystem services that we're looking for. And the fastest way to create a forest and the conditions that they bring is to plant a forest that's going to grow quickly and is easy to manage. Management is 95% of agroforestry. Things like harvesting, weeding, pruning, and organizing organic material. Now, when you're working up and down the slope, it feels way more natural, way easier and way safer to walk up a slope rather than across a slope, especially if they're narrow tracks or if it's really steep. It's way easier to walk directly up the slope. And this is from my own personal experiences, but also the examples of other sites, other professionals and practitioners doing this work on sloped land. For example, at Namaste's site in Paraná, in the south of Brazil where we're at, we managed a bunch of systems. Most of them were on contour, and then there were some that were straight up the slope. The systems that were straight up the slope, way easier to manage. Ernst's new planting areas. When I visited his site last year, all of his new areas are being planted straight up the slope. And it confused me. For the first few weeks of being there and seeing all this planting going straight up the slope, I thought to myself, why don't these people in Brazil do work on contour like all the books say? Shouldn't they be planting on contour like permaculture? Have they not read a permaculture book? There's a reason they're doing it that way. They're ahead of the curve. Planting up the slope is way safer, easier to manage, and results in a better outcome. Another example, Jorge's site in Costa Rica, which I visited. They had planted everything on contour, and they found it really difficult to manage. Especially with how steep it is, they're considering doing all the new areas directly up the slope. Can't blame them. I've even got clients, and there's lots of projects with people happening in the fellowship where they planted big terraces on steep land, and it's just more difficult, more expensive, and now there's a bunch of wasted space in between the terraces because it's so steep. When you have things working up the slope, you can utilize the whole piece of land rather than being stuck with this really steep area in between your two terraces that you can't even access. I've even had projects that I've been planting recently, client projects here in New Zealand, on the same site, up the slope and across on contour. The areas being planted up the slope, way easier to plant, way easier to manage. So that's my preference moving forward, is planting directly up the slope. Now here's where I would utilize contour. When I have my tree lines going straight up the slope, I would still want to have a large access path, especially for vehicles on contour. So I can bring my vehicles in, and then all the activities, all the pruning and the management, but particularly the harvesting. As I'm harvesting, I don't want to be walking all around the slope with heavy baskets of fruit. There's a beautiful rainbow right there. I want to be able to harvest and walk down the slope directly to a vehicle, put the harvest in the vehicle, and it goes, whether it's a quad, a wheelbarrow, or a larger vehicle. So the large access paths I would be putting on contour, and then uphill from that, I'd be planting directly up the slope for management activities, harvesting, pruning, weeding, etc. Now, speaking of management, let's look at the next lesson, which is heavy resets are a key dynamic in syntropic agroforestry that set it apart from traditional permaculture. A lot of the food forests that I see done by permaculture designers, they're usually really stagnant systems and input dependent. I've seen so many permaculture food forests that continuously require wood chips and wheelbarrows of wood chips, dependent on outside resources and a bunch of extra labor. The regular heavy pruning, particularly of support species, is that key dynamic, that primary action that opens up sunlight, it cycles the nutrients, and creates a growth pulse that's just missing when you have a stagnant or more permaculture-based food forest that doesn't have those heavy interventions incorporated. This heavy pruning regime, this management practice, creates really dynamic conditions. Rather than being stagnant in the same conditions, you're accelerating the ecological succession of your landscape from support species into edible productive forests. You can see here we've pruned an overgrown food forest or a stagnant food forest with our support trees as well, and pruned. We've cycled the nutrients, more sunlight, and growth pulse. This dynamic is also seen in natural forests because forests aren't stagnant. When you think of a natural forest, it's not one system that's all the same age. It's more of a patchwork, or it's like a tapestry of different aged areas, right? And the beautiful part about this is it incorporates that disturbance dynamic into our agriculture, because even our low strata and our medium strata fruit trees, they don't want stagnant shade. They don't want shade that's the same all year round for 5 years. They want that dynamic of heavy pruning, an influx of sunlight, flowering, and then the shade comes back. And they want that over and over again seasonally. In many species, that heavy pruning, that flush of sunlight, induces flowering to be more productive. And that's why these systems can be so productive and grow so vigorously. I see that here in my systems as well. Stagnant citrus versus productive strong, vigorous citrus that get that pruning dynamic. And this dynamic creates the opportunity for you to fix successional gaps. Whenever you prune heavily in your food forest, you have the opportunity to replace species that maybe are missing. Do a heavy prune, you reintroduce new species. And so it allows you to fix either missing strata that you don't have or successional gaps. When you do that heavy pruning, it's the best moment to seed and plant new trees into your food forest. And these dynamic conditions create it so that plants have more function in the system. Remember when I said that trees don't want stagnant shade, they don't want shade that's the same consistently throughout their whole lifespan. They want that dynamic. That brings them more function. They do more photosynthesis and they have more function, so they're healthier, they're stronger, and more resistant to pest and disease pressure. Because what they're doing in that photosynthesis, when they're freshly pruned and they're happy and they're in their right strata, what's happening is they're creating complete proteins. In their leaves, they're creating complete proteins. Whereas when they're sad, when they're stagnant and not having a lot of function, they're creating free amino acids. Much easier to digest from insect pressure, much more prone to disease when they're creating free amino acids versus complete proteins in a healthy system where they're in their strata and they're getting that dynamic condition. So something that's really important and is often overlooked about pruning is managing the boundaries, managing the edges of your system. Nature doesn't delineate between your food forest and the surrounding vegetation. It's all one system in nature. When you're pruning your agroforestry system, if you just stop at the boundary of your system, the nearby vegetation is going to start being stagnant and having a negative influence on the edges of your system. And so what you want to do is when you're managing your agroforestry system, you're also managing the boundaries, the edges. You can do it in this shape where it's a V shape, right, away from your system. So you're taking the largest trees that are closest to the system and you're managing those. And there's two things that are happening here. One is you're getting the extra organic material into the system from the edges, but you're also treating the area more systemically. And so suddenly the edges of the system start to become incorporated into that growth pulse, into that dynamic of heavy pruning with your agroforestry system, instead of being held back by it. Now let's talk managing biomass. Mulching with in situ biomass is the primary mechanism for creating fertility in your agroforestry system. In situ, as in it's come from within the system, not from outside inputs. And so what you're doing here is when you're putting organic material on the floor of the system, you're feeding soil biology, you're increasing the moisture retention in the soil, protecting against erosion, you're cycling nutrients, you're not importing your fertility like with the permaculture examples. Now, the order of operations is super important when you're actually organizing your material, because you want to put the woody, coarse material in direct contact with the soil. And then you want to put sticks and other green foliage, things like banana leaves, on top. That's going to keep the moisture in, and the wood is going to be directly in contact with the soil. You're trying to create really inviting conditions for soil biology, things like earthworms, fungus, bacteria, microorganisms. And so with this order of operations, having the largest stuff in the bottom, the sticks, and the green material on top, this is going to help to dictate the order in which you prune things, which we'll get to at our next site. But first, let's talk about how I've misunderstood the role of annual vegetables in agroforestry. Forest vegetables. Vegetables are an early succession species. A lot of us are familiar with this successional diagram with short-lived species and long-lived species. And an annual vegetable is a short life cycle species. It's the start of succession at this area, which this half is the accumulation stage and this part is the abundance stage. And so I used to think that because vegetables were these short life cycle creatures, they're at the beginning of succession, that they belong here at the start in the accumulation phase. I was wrong. In reality, they're forest creatures from the abundance stage. Vegetables depend on trees. If we have our little tomato plant, it depends on trees. But specifically, they depend on the clearing dynamic in a forest. Remember before we talked about the patchwork of forests being at different successional stages? What happens is a clearing occurs, whether it's a windstorm, large animals, a tree falls down and brings a bunch of others with it, new sunlight, growth pulse. That's the moment where the vegetables sit in succession. They don't sit at this early accumulation where there's no fertility. They wait until there's a forest condition, it gets ripped down, it gets cleared, a disturbance. That's when those vegetables come in. Vegetables love rich soil with good organic material, decaying wood, leaves, and biological activity. And what we do in gardening with annual vegetables is we fake these conditions with things like compost, mulch, and artificial fertilizers to simulate the condition of a forest clearing. Show me a permaculture garden where they're not bringing in compost, where they're not bringing in mulch, where they're not bringing in biochar from outside the system. And I don't mean outside the system as in a different part of the property. I mean within the growing system itself. Show me a garden system where all of the inputs for that garden, for growing in that area, come from within the boundary of the system and it's not dependent on something from outside. This is what it means to generate organic material in situ. And so my misunderstanding was that annual vegetables aren't from this early accumulator stage of succession just because they're short life cycle. Yes, they're short life cycle, but they live here in the abundance stage after a disturbance. And so that disturbance event looks like this. You have another succession from this disturbance point. If the forest gets ripped down here, you have a new succession which starts again with short life cycle, medium life cycle, and long life cycle species. This right here, that moment after that accumulation and abundance stage, that's where the annual vegetables live. And so when you're creating an annual vegetable system with syntropic agroforestry and the focus is production of vegetables and not fruit, here's how you would do that. You would have your typical vegetable beds, but to support those from within the system, you would have tree lines strictly with support trees. You wouldn't include fruit trees, you would just have things to prune, to feed into the annual vegetable lines every season. And what you're doing is you're doing a full reset on these lines, on your support trees, whether it's just support trees, herbaceous things, bananas, anything that you can fully reset, either coppice or pollard, a heavy prune and reset the whole thing, feed all the organic material into the annual vegetables. When you plant, as the annual vegetables grow and you harvest them, these tree lines regrow so that when you come back the next season, you do the same thing. You cut them down, you feed the organic material. That's what an annual vegetable system looks like with syntropic principles. You're keeping the inputs coming from within the system. But the reason you can't plant fruit trees into these lines is because eventually, after year 3, 4, you start to preserve the fruit trees. You don't heavily prune them. You don't do a full reset on them. And that starts to transition the focus of the system into fruit production, because what you're doing is then you're saying to the whole system, actually we want to prioritize the development of our fruit trees instead of fully resetting these lines. And so suddenly it's not a full systemic reset anymore. You're leaving the trees and it becomes a more tree dominant system. And then suddenly the vegetables, they get that signal. It becomes a situation less suited for annual vegetables and more of that secondary regrowth forest, right? And eventually back into a tree-based abundance system. So the annual vegetable system has a focus of annual vegetables, leave the fruit trees out of it, have a different area for your fruit-based agroforestry. For example, I tried planting annual vegetables in my 3-year-old agroforestry system, and despite good soil conditions, despite doing a really heavy reset, I didn't do a full reset, I didn't take everything down, there was plenty of sunlight, but they still struggled. Because systemically, the area had moved past annuals. It was into the secondary stage of trees, because I wanted to keep the fruit trees standing. So you need to choose the focus of the system, whether it's animals, fruit production, berries, annual vegetables, fodder. Choose the focus of the system. Yes, there can be things that support that, but the focus of the system is going to be the decision factor for how you manage the area. And planting vegetables with only support species allows for this full system reset dynamic that they require. Integrating trees into your annual vegetable systems recreates the natural successional stage for the vegetables. Vegetables benefit from the presence of trees and that clearing dynamic, that full reset, full sunlight, everything comes down. That's their original habitat, is forest clearings. We're about to move to a new site in Brazil, but if you're enjoying this and you want a deeper dive, I've got a 3-hour training. It's free, it's on school. Go check it out if you want a deeper dive into all this content in the food forest family. All right, let's see what we learned in Central Brazil. Abandoned systems. So abandoned or even poorly managed agroforestry systems, what they do is they become emergent dominated. If these are our emergent trees with our other strata trees underneath, emergent right at the top, abandoned systems become emergent dominated, meaning these trees that need and want full sun, they take over. Left unpruned, they starve these lower strata species of the sunlight that they want and need to stay healthy. Remember, they're missing that pruning dynamic. And what happens is this leads to reduced health and reduced productivity of your understory species. And so a lot of these fast-growing emergent species, things like eucalyptus, poplar, willow, acacia, while they're really important to move that succession forward and provide biomass and cycle nutrients, if they're left unmanaged, they can dominate and really hold a system back, reducing the diversity and the health of the system. Now, later on in the system, if you have nut trees and timber trees, these large things, you can still have those around, and you can still have trees in the understory, but they'll still be less productive if you're not heavily pruning, because the light and shade dynamics of heavy pruning get disrupted by having unpruned trees. So these unmanaged systems become really stagnant. They become more difficult to manage because when you leave a tree unpruned for 5-10 years, it becomes way more dangerous, way more difficult or expensive and tricky than if you continuously manage it. Way easier to keep a system maintained than it is to retroactively go back. We saw a lot of 12-year-old abandoned systems. Really scary. And the thing is, these eucalyptus will naturally start managing themselves, but it's more dangerous because they're dropping limbs on trees, they're breaking in dangerous ways, and the understory isn't as productive if you're not managing the system. These trees and systems will self-manage, right? Branches will break and fall, windstorms and other natural forces will prune these trees over time, but it's more destructive and not so controlled. It's difficult and expensive to manage later, and so just keep your trees pruned. There's this really great expression from my friend Josh. He says that no tree grows faster than a chainsaw can run. So with that being said, let's dive into the next section, which is pruning eucalyptus. When it comes to your equipment and climbing gear for pruning eucalyptus, the first couple years are really easy, right? You can use secateurs and even a handsaw to remove the lower branches while it's still young. One of my favorite tools is actually a pole pruner, right? It's an extending telescopic pruner with a secateur on the end. It reaches 5 meters. Fantastic, I use it all the time. As the trees grow taller and you need to manage further up and you want to take the head out of the tree, you want to take the crown out, becomes more advanced management. And for this you need a little bit more equipment. The first is a really good handsaw. I prefer these Silky tools. I have the Zubat. They're fantastic, really great quality. Got a discount code if you're in New Zealand. I use them all the time. I actually took a bunch of them over to Brazil on this trip and gave them out to farmers. Huge blessing. Thank you, Silky, for providing those. That's one of the key pieces of managing equipment. If you can get away from having a chainsaw up in the tree, much safer. The other thing you'll want is a straight ladder that can reach to the point that you want to cut, around 5.5 to 6 meters. And the thing that's going to keep you really safe when you're up in the tree pruning is a harness. Makes a world of difference so you're not having to hold on to the tree. It lets you relax and be more comfortable. Now, when it comes to your cutting technique, what you're doing when you're up in that tree is you're cutting a wedge in the tree, or a face, in the direction that you want it to fall in. You're cutting about 30% into the side of the tree, creating that wedge, and then the back cut to let the tree drop. And what you're doing is you're directing the crown to minimize the impact to nearby trees. You're allowing the other trees to be unpruned when you do this because you start managing your emergent canopy layers so that all the unpruned trees below, especially if you have bananas or other large leafy foliage trees, you're allowing them to stay unpruned so that when this comes down, it can have some weight to it. It's coming into an unpruned system, and that just helps to protect the lower strata trees from any damage. So prune your emergent trees first and work your way down. Now, in terms of the height of your trees, it totally depends on the system and what you're comfortable with and what the goals of the system are. If you're trying to fill every single strata, so you have a low strata species, a medium strata species, and a high strata species with your emergent, it would need to be a bit taller than if you were having a less complex system with only 2 strata. And so the more strata you put in and the bigger you want them to be, the higher you need to raise the canopy of that eucalyptus, of that emergent tree. For my systems, I'm aiming for around 5.5 to 6 meters tall. That's going to allow me to fit a high tree, a medium, and a low. And what this does is it prevents canopy conflict. And so my eucalyptus canopy isn't conflicting with my high strata species, and that's not conflicting with my medium and the low. Every canopy has their space. So when you're pruning the actual eucalyptus, let's say that's our cut, you actually want to leave some branches. You don't want to cut it so there's no branches left. And preferably 2, maybe 3 branches. What that's going to do is that's going to signal for the eucalypt where to resprout from, so that when it starts to regrow, it knows it already has that pattern developed and it's going to resprout from those branches. Otherwise, if you don't leave those there, it'll resprout all down the trunk, be really messy, and then you're left with canopy conflict. Because if this sprouts all the way down the trunk, suddenly its regrowth is conflicting with the other trees. You want to control where it resprouts from. Now, I saw some really great examples of this when I was traveling in Brazil, especially at Amadeo's place where he has 10-year-old eucalyptus, and they're called his guardians. The eucalyptus guardians, it's basically a high pollard, and the reason he calls them a guardian is they're shaped like a tree, flexing its arms, looking over the system. Essentially, it looks like somebody's flexing their arms, being a guardian of the agroforestry. And so what you're doing is you're creating a nest up at the top at around 5.5 meters. You're creating this nest with these 3 main arms, and these arms are conducting where the resprouts occur. So every year when you prune them, the tree knows where to resprout from. You're going to be regularly managing from there, telling the tree, this is where I want you to resprout from. So you're creating this nest where you can go sit, raised arms, flexing, as the emergent strata, the protectors, the guardians of your food forest. When you have a line of eucalyptus to prune, what you don't want to do is go and prune them all so you have this big mess of organic material at the bottom to manage. Instead, you want to go up one at a time, drop the crown out, and then manage that crown, organize the material, wood in contact with the soil, leaves on top, really nicely organized, and then move to the next tree and do the same. Now, this is really great if you have a team. If not, just do it on your own. But here's why it's important. 2 reasons. 1, if you go through and you prune 9, 10, 12 eucalyptus and then you're left with this big mess, we're busy people. Your day might get interrupted. You might have to go do something for a few hours or for a few days and you don't get back. By the time you get back, all this material has been sitting oxidizing. The sun has cooked it. It's got less value, no moisture, no humidity to add into the soil. If you manage it right away, you're utilizing all of the moisture, all the humidity that's in those leaves. It improves the decomposition and improves the nutrient cycling when you manage one at a time. So it's best if you have a team of people. One person's up pruning the tree, dropping the crowns, the other people are there organizing material behind them. And you can trade off when the climber needs a break. Now, let's talk banana management. Bananas are known as the queen or the mothers in agroforestry. They raise other species, they nurse them, they shelter them, and they have many functions within the system. Similar to eucalyptus, bananas require aggressive management. They require aggressive management because they're extroverted, they grow very quickly. And so what you're doing when you're managing bananas is you're thinning them down to just 3 generations. The grandmother, the mother, and the daughter. And you're also ensuring that no 2 generations are going to be in the same clump competing for space and nutrients at the same time. And so when you're selecting which suckers to remove and to keep, here are some helpful things to keep in mind. There's 2 kinds of suckers that we usually see. One is called a sword sucker and another is a water sucker. The sword suckers are these really vigorous, firm, solid pups. They have usually really thin leaves that come straight out. They're more triangular shaped, and if you shake them, they're really sturdy. That's a really vigorous plant, and it's going to grow really well. The other one is a water sucker. It's usually really thin, it's got big broad leaves, and it's really loose if you shake it, and it's just not going to grow as vigorously. So you're selecting out the water suckers, selecting for the sword suckers. And the second thing you're looking for when you're managing your bananas is their positioning, especially in the tree line. If you have a bunch of trees in your line and then you have a clump of bananas right here, I'm going to preference bananas that are leaning out this way into the access paths. I don't want my bananas leaning across into the line because then they're going to start to interfere with other trees. I want them to be hanging out into the access paths, into the walkways, not shrouding a bunch of the other young trees. And then just to reiterate, because it's important on the organizing of biomass, when you have your wood placed down on the surface of the soil from your eucalyptus that you cut, you have your logs in contact with the soil, you have your branches and your sticks and your leaves from the eucalyptus, and then your banana logs, which you split down the middle, split them in half, face down on top of all the wood and leaves on top of that. And that creates a really nice, compact, moisture, inviting conditions for worms, fungi, biology to begin its work. Split the banana logs down the middle, face down on top of the wood. As you're removing these banana stems, you're actually cutting a bowl into the stem so you can get the meristem so that it doesn't re-sprout. You don't just cut it flat, you dig with the machete into the base till you're cutting the meristem out so it doesn't regrow. That's good banana management. So doing this will ensure that you have healthier bananas and a more productive system, and basically maintaining balance in your agroforestry. Now, this next one is super exciting. Seed bombs, or muvuca. A muvuka, or a seed bomb, is a mix of diverse seeds that you plant. It can be a combination of fruit, timber, medicinals, support trees, and any other plants. And this whole mixture is mixed into a single planting process. So you have multiple different successional time frames, multiple different strata, and what it does is it mimics natural forest regeneration, where there's a huge diversity in the seed bank of the soil. That's not something we have naturally these days, and so we need to artificially go and collect seeds from our local area, create muvuka, and plant them to mimic that process. And what this does is it allows for efficient seed distribution. You can seed the entire system without planting each species individually. It saves time and labor, and it ensures a high diversity of species to fill all these different ecological niches. And I've seen people be really meticulous. You can take cups and measure out exactly how many seeds of what go in each cup, and then you're spacing the cup of seeds every 2 meters, and you're putting that cup in the soil in your line. I've also seen way more rough and rugged ways of just mixing all the seeds together in a little bit of medium like sand or compost, and then you're just grabbing a handful of that mix and planting it every meter or so. Now, one really cool thing I've seen is having 2 different muvuka for the same system. For example, you can have A lines paired with B lines, and so let's say your system wants to have a larger scale, a little bit more commercialized, less complexity in each line. You would say planting your emergent species with your medium species. That allows for a big gap in between. The whole system can be shorter, more easy to manage, more simple. And then your other species, high and low. Same deal. They can occupy their strata, but not be so complex, a little bit lower, easier to manage. So you can have your A muvuka has high and low species, and your B muvuka has emergent and medium. And I've seen that work really well. I've seen really beautiful systems done like that. You can also just make edible lines and support lines with those different muvuka. So having all your edible trees in one line and your support trees in the other, that's another way of reducing the complexity of management. But the best part about seed bombs or muvuka is it's a low-cost mechanism for agroforestry. A huge part of agroforestry is collecting seeds from your local environment. It reduces the cost of implementation, and it turns your site into a biodiversity hotspot. Our systems often resemble a library of local species. And so a big part of agroforestry is understanding that local species, even the ones that are weedy or exotic and not originally from that area, they have an important role to play. They're part of a repair sequence that contributes towards ecological restoration. And so don't be afraid to engage actively in this process of looking around your landscape and seeing what species might offer some service in an agroforestry system. A lot of these pioneer species added into your seed bombs or into your muvuka offer a really special way to accelerate the development, accelerate the rebuilding and restructuring of your soil, bringing back fertility. Now, if you're looking to apply these principles in your own food forest, we're doing step-by-step walkthroughs of designing syntropic food forests for yourself or for your clients. We're also doing weekly food forest roast calls where you get your system reviewed and roasted by the community. If either of those would benefit you, we'd love to see you inside. Now, let's go to the northeast of Brazil, using weeds to prepare an area. Castor oil are classified as an invasive weed. Now, at this particular site, they weren't intentionally planted here. They naturally seeded and germinated after a couple trees came to the end of their life cycle. What happened is it created a really dense forest of castor oil. This might scare ecologists, but it's an example of how nature selects species that match the conditions. It was really degraded and exposed here, and then there was the opportunity for the castor to grow and begin that repair sequence. Here's how we utilized this to our advantage when planting this agroforestry system. The castor, growing for just 12 months, started to already decompact the soil with their roots. They're really good at that. A lot of these pioneer species are. They started breaking up the ground, generating organic material in their canopies and below ground in their root systems, and they kick-started that successional process to have healthier soil. And so when we went in to plant our agroforestry system, we began to clear the area really strategically. First, we figured out where our lines wanted to be, and then we just strategically cleared just in those lines. And what that allowed us to do is to work and to prepare the soil in the shade of the other castor that we left standing. So we manually prepared the soil, started planting our bananas, and then after we'd prepared the soil and started cutting down the other trees, we organized all the organic material in the shape of an M on each planting bed. And so where all of our trees would germinate, and all of our seeds were planted, and our cuttings were pushed in, and the trees planted, right in between these two mounds of organic material that the castor had generously provided for us. What this did is it concentrated the conditions for life directly around our lines, directly around our trees where they wanted. Moisture retention, decomposition, and we did all of this without disrupting seed germination because we left that middle area open for them. Eventually this did become a full system reset. We took down all the castor, we had our new lines planted, so this was a full systemic reset. We even pruned the surrounding vegetation, the surrounding castor even on the outside of the fence. We also pruned those to make it systemic. We put in a ton of edibles like cassava, coconut, cactus, and a huge diversity of fruit trees. Regardless of whatever climate you're in, you can still apply these steps to improve your agroforestry. Identify the local pioneer species, plant them and allow them to create better conditions. Strategically prune and manage them, moving from these accumulators into an abundance ecosystem. Essentially, we're embracing the role of these pioneer species and the service they have to provide. So what we did here was essentially making use of the castor oil as they were fulfilling their function. These natural processes of succession can be utilized to kickstart your agroforestry system or your food forest. And this is done by understanding the role of pioneers. This next one's really good. We're almost there. Pruning fruit trees inside of your agroforestry system. So while we were with Namaste, we had a masterclass on pruning fruit trees inside of an agroforestry system. Specifically citrus, because I've got a lot of citrus here, and so I wanted to get a deep dive into that. But this applies for a lot of fruit trees inside of agroforestry systems. The key thing here is you're pruning with a systemic approach. You're analyzing your system holistically and thinking about how each species in your agroforestry system interacts with the system as a whole. This is your unpruned agroforestry system. And before you begin pruning, as you're approaching your intervention, you're asking yourself two questions before you begin. The first question you're asking yourself is, what good is happening here? This gets you in the frame of paying attention to what good things are already happening within the system. And the second question you're asking yourself is, how can I be of service? How can I help this system and make it better? And so when you're pruning, you're ensuring that what's happening is you are taking all these species strata into consideration. Emergent, high, medium, and low. Strata is not based on the height of the tree. It's based on the light requirements. How much sunlight or how much filtration does this plant want? Emergent species want zero filtration. They want full sun. But a lot of species, high, medium, and low, they want varying degrees of filtered sunlight. And so that's what you're paying attention to when you're managing your system. When you're managing your emergent layer, you're leaving about 20% of that strata occupied. When you're pruning your high layer, you're leaving about 40% of that strata occupied. Medium, 60% of that strata occupied, and then low would be 80%. Here's the key. When you're pruning your strata, you're wanting to leave a gap of about 0.5 to 1 meter between each strata. So between the bottom of the emergent strata and the top of the high strata, you're leaving a gap of 0.5 meter to 1 meter between each strata. That gives the canopy space to breathe, airflow, sunlight. And so between each of these strata, you're leaving that 0.5 meter gap between your emergents, highs, medium, and lows. 0.5 meter gap minimum between each strata as you're managing. When you're pruning your citrus trees in your medium strata, that might go from 1.5 meters in height up to 3 meters. So it's occupying a 1.5 meter strata or space from 1.5 to 3 meters. That's the space for your citrus. And so every time you prune that tree, you're maintaining it in that same strata. So you always prune it to 3 meters and 1.5. So it stays in that strata. Same with the eucalyptus. That's why we're always pruning it from that same place, the guardian shape. So it's always occupying that space. Same with the avocado in the high strata. It's always staying, what's 0.5 above 3? The avocado stays from 3.5, and if it wants to be 0.5 meter below the eucalyptus, say it goes to 5 meters. If your eucalyptus is at 5.5, that's 1.5 meters of strata for your avocado. And so you can start to see how you're going to structure your system or how it's going to play out as you manage, as you put these diverse species in, how much you want to fill into one row versus the benefit of teasing things out between your emergents and mediums into one line and your highs and lows into the other. Makes things more simple. I want to give you guys a checklist for pruning fruit trees in your agroforestry system. Point number 1, the crown. You're pruning the crown out. You're pruning internal branches, branches that point inwards towards the center of the tree, branches that are crossing or rubbing on each other or dead, branches that are stacked vertically on top of each other. And so if they're stacked like this, one on top of the other, The bottom one's not going to be that productive anyways. Give that space to the top one. Branches that are pointing straight down or straight up, the ones that are pointing straight up are generally called water suckers. And you can actually turn those water suckers into productive branches by pruning them at a point so they branch and turn into fruiting wood. You can use them to your advantage if you have a gap in your canopy. And that's where the balance one comes in. So you want to make sure your tree is balanced, and if it's missing a section, use a water sucker, prune it to make it branch, become fruiting wood to fill that gap. Let's talk about our last piece, which is very exciting. Turning orchards into agroforestry systems, retrofitting orchards. Now, this is great because this is my context here, and a lot of people have this similar context of having an existing orchard that they want to retrofit and turn into an agroforestry system. So when you're transitioning a monoculture orchard into a diverse agroforestry system, there's a few key frameworks to think through. One of the most important patterns to start off with, starting off trialing smaller blocks to reduce the risk and to make smaller mistakes, because they will be made. You will have a learning curve. And so if you've got an area where you have higher disease pressure than other areas, or if you have more gaps, that's a great invitation to start there. And you're starting out with really high diversity. You're identifying successful patterns, what species work really well, what management styles, and then you're expanding each season from there. Now, some thoughtful considerations to make. If you're growing citrus or any medium strata species, you need to think about what will coexist with your existing crop. Another medium strata species won't pair as nicely as if I went to go find a high strata species or an emergent or a low strata species to pair with the citrus or pair with the existing crop that you already have. Things that occupy different strata and life cycle to what you already have growing. There's a really helpful framework called and/or, and it goes like this. If you're choosing between two medium strata species that occupy the same life cycle, that will be the case of or. You need to choose one or the other. Medium strata species occupying the same life cycle, or medium strata species with an emergent species, that's and. And so if you had citrus and pecans, medium emergent, that's a great combo because they occupy different strata. And if you have two high strata species, let's say you have avocados and macadamias, similar life cycles, both high strata species, that's more of an or situation. Peaches and walnuts, different strata. And avocados and citrus, high and medium. And you're planning for succession. You're keeping the future in mind. What species are what strata and what life cycle, what works well for your area. You're trialing a bunch with huge diversity. A huge question also to consider is what equipment do you have to manage with, and how do you cycle biomass efficiently? And what stage is your orchard currently at? If citrus orchards typically only last 25 years and we're at year 20, maybe I need to consider a full heavy reset for 5 years from now, when everything gets fully reset, a bunch of things get replanted systemically. So understanding what the commercial life cycle of your species is and what stage you're currently at, and how that will afford you opportunities to go replanting for that next cycle. Creating a food forest isn't just about growing food. It's about rebuilding the connection with ourselves and nature. In every seed we plant, we rediscover our role as stewards of the environment. Not only are we healing the land, but we're also healing ourselves. We're aligning our lives with the rhythms and the seasonality of the natural world. This is a journey about much more than production. It's about coming home to the living world around us. Keep planting, keep learning, and trust that your efforts today will bear fruits for generations. Let's reforest our landscapes, and in doing so, reforesting our own hearts. And if you want to see the lessons that I learned traveling around Brazil solo this year, check this video out.